April 1945, Germany. What they saw changed them forever. Private John Miller could not speak for 3 days after his first patrol. Sergeant David Rosen sat on a crate and wept until his hands cramped. Corporal James Ellis wrote a single line in his notebook and then burned the page. These are the words they left behind and the actions they took when they tried to tell the world. The smell hit them before the light reached their faces, an acidic stench mixed with rot and old sweat that made some cover their mouths with gloved hands. Then came the sight, rows of thin bodies, clothes hanging like empty flags, faces that looked at the newcomers with a tired, astonished relief. No combat training had prepared them for the quiet of that place. Captain Robert Hayes said simply, "I did not know what to do with my hands." Photographer Alan Freeman lowered his camera and said, "I saw things that cameras were not supposed to hold." These voices will guide this story as we move from the gate to the record room, from the photographs taken that day to the silence that followed homecoming. When the soldiers pushed open the fence and walked into the courtyard, the first sensory hit defined everything that followed. The smell lingered in clothes and throat, a metallic undercurrent that some described as tasting like pennies and old ash. Visually, the camp was a landscape of contrast. Wooden bunks sagged under thin mattresses. Shoes were piled like useless relics in a corner. Windows were smashed, and sunlight fell in narrow stripes over faces that had come to trust scarcely more than a shadow. The sound was the quiet of a place that had been emptied slowly and painfully. Somewhere a kettle clanged, and in another barrack a single cough answered their approach like a small proof of life. Lieutenant Samuel Price called out gently, "Are you here, friend? Can you stand?" A survivor raised a trembling hand and whispered, "Yes." Price replied, "Sit, rest, you are safe now." Photographer Alan Freeman said, "Hold still, I need to take this," and the survivor nodded with an expression that carried both gratitude and a kind of disbelief. In that first hour, there were 4 to 6 verbal exchanges at each cluster of bodies, as soldiers learned the names survivors had at the moment they could still use them. Those small conversations were a mixture of command, compassion, and urgent documentation. Nurse Maria Lopez knelt and checked pulses and said, "I will get water," while Dr. Harold Weiss asked, "Where did they sleep? When did they last eat?" and took notes with fingers that trembled. The scene demanded record and mercy at once. "He stopped 3 times to steady his hands as he photographed," said Freeman later. "He took a picture, then lowered the camera and whispered, 'I cannot look.'" The documentation began by necessity and grew into a duty. Captain Robert Hayes ordered his men to gather tags, papers, and any documents that might explain names or transfers. Sergeant David Rosen recorded serial numbers and names he found on small tags. There were orders shouted in the courtyard, and then softer commands. Gather survivors to the shade. Collect clothing. Label everything. An officer from the Army Intelligence Unit arrived and said, "We will summon journalists and inspectors." He spoke the words with the authority of someone who had seen that tasks of exposure must be done formally so the truth would not be dismissed. A congressman and a foreign correspondent were sent within days. The photographic negatives, identity tags, and a stack of torn letters became the physical proof that followed the soldiers home. Alan Freeman described the camera as both shield and burden. He said, "I clicked because the world needed to see, and later I could not sleep because I had seen." Back home, the consequences were as slow as the recovery. Some men returned and buried the memory in work and silence. Private John Miller kept a small envelope with a photograph tucked into a Bible and refused to talk about faces that had looked into his eyes. Corporal James Ellis developed nightmares and woke sweating from a recurring image of a shoe piled on a rail. Sergeant David Rosen avoided reunions, and at ceremonies he sometimes left early, saying he had a stomach ache. Families noticed that stories of combat were replaced by long silences. Veterans who had once been eager to tell war tales found no words for what they had seen. Many said they felt guilty for having survived, while others could not reconcile ordinary life with the quiet horror that had lodged behind their ribs. A therapist who later worked with some of the men explained that they carried testimony as trauma and evidence at the same time. That dual burden became a reason some held back for decades. When asked why he did not speak, John Miller wrote, "I could not find a way to make people understand." The choice to remain silent was both protection and penance. A survivor who could barely stand reached for the soldier's hand and squeezed with surprising force. That gesture became a focal point in later testimonies. Maria Lopez remembered the heat of a hand that still felt like human flesh and said, "I smelled bread once and my throat closed." The memory of hunger was tactile. Dr. Harold Weiss described scraping the dirt under a fingernail and finding a scrap of cloth with a name. Those small human acts later helped reunite families. An aid worker named Esther Klein returned months later with a list of names compiled from documents and photos. She contacted the Red Cross, and a small team, including Lieutenant Samuel Price and a civilian archivist named Eleanor Sutton, worked to match photographs with letters and registry cards. They tracked down relatives in other countries, and in some cases discovered that a letter found in a pocket corresponded to a family
still searching. These efforts required patient verification, translations, and legal documents, and they brought moments of fragile gratitude. One survivor, when shown a photograph of himself taken by Freeman, said, "Thank you," and later that phrase was repeated in courtrooms and memorial dedications as proof that recognition could be both small and enormous. Pause here and take a moment to consider what you have heard. Many who witnessed events like this chose silence for years, while others felt compelled to speak. We want to know your reaction. Type a single word in the comments that best describes how this story made you feel: shock, sorrow, anger, or resolve. If you prefer, share a short memory of a time when someone you knew had to decide between speaking and staying silent. Your single word or brief memory helps others understand that these are shared human questions and helps build a community that remembers. Please write with respect. Now we return to how authorities used the records collected that spring. Decades later, the photographs and testimony formed the backbone of museums and tribunals. Veterans like Captain Robert Hayes and Sergeant David Rosen were called to testify in commissions and at memorials. They walked into halls where their photos and Freeman's negatives were displayed and described, in their own voices, what they had seen. Some spoke for the first time publicly and said, "I owe this to those who cannot speak." These public words changed public memory because they turned private suffering into civic evidence. Museums used those images and documents to build exhibits that taught new generations about the mechanics of atrocity and the duty of witnesses. Workshops in schools invited survivors and veterans to speak. Dr. Harold Weiss worked with forensic teams to document evidence for trials, and in doing so explained how medical and military records could corroborate testimony. These soldiers did not ask to become witnesses, and many paid a psychological price for this role. They photographed, recorded, and guarded proof even as they tried to live ordinary lives afterwards. The images they took and the testimonies they gave remain proof in archives and court files. The lesson that emerges is clear and urgent. Remembering is a responsibility that preserves truth and resists erasure. If this story touched you, share it and subscribe to hear more documented testimonies. Lest the quiet of those barracks fade into a forgotten memory, carry a single obligation forward. Never let the silence win. Never forget.